Andrew Tabler is a Next Generation Fellow in the Program on Arab Politics at the Washington Institute, where he focuses on how the United States can engage with Syria in a way that best advances U.S. interests. A journalist and researcher, Mr. Tabler has achieved unparalleled qualitative and long-term access to Bashar al-Assad Syria. He is the co-founder and former editor-in-chief of Syria Today, Syria's first private sector English language magazine, and has been a media consultant for Syrian non-governmental organizations under the patronage of Syrian First Lady Asma al-Assad. In 14 years of resident consultancy, research, and journalism in the Middle East, Mr. Tabler served most recently as a consultant on U.S.-Syria relations for the International Crisis Group and as a fellow of the Institute on Current World Affairs, writing on Syrian, Lebanese, and Middle Eastern affairs. Dr. Zuhdi Jasser is a founding member of Save Syria Now, a growing national group of Americans of Syrian descent who came together in April 2011 to help better shape American policy to facilitate a future-free Syria without Bashar Assad. Dr. Jasser is a first-generation Syrian American and Sunni Muslim whose parents fled the oppressive regime of Syria in 1966 for American freedom. Dr. Jasser also serves as president of the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a think tank and activist American Muslim organization that advocates for the principles of the United States Constitution and the separation of mosque and state. Dr. Jasser is a nationally recognized expert in the contest of ideas against political Islam and American Islamist organizations, having spoken at hundreds of national and international events and routinely appearing on national news. Dr. Jasser regularly briefs members of both the United States House and Senate on the threat of political Islam and recently testified before the House Homeland Security Committee and the Subcommittee on the Constitution of the House Judiciary Committee. Shirko Abbas is president of the Kurdistan National Assembly of Syria, KNAS, and founding member of Syrian Democracy Council. He is a native of the Kurdistan region of Syria and a veteran Kurdish human rights activist with extensive experience in political organizing among Syrian Kurdish parties. Mr. Abbas has served the Kurdish community in a number of capacities, including as founder and director of the Center for Democracy in the Middle East and founding member of the American Kurdistan Friendship League. Mr. Abbas has advised Refugees International, Open Society Justice Initiative, testified in Congress on behalf of stateless Kurds in Syria, and briefed White House and various key U.S. congressional members on the events in Syria. Thank you so much, and I'd like to open it up to our panelists, who will speak for approximately 10 minutes each, and then we will open it up for a Q&A moderated by my colleague Jessica Lee in Congressman McDermott's office. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much for that kind introduction. Can everyone hear me? Good afternoon. I wish we could be meeting under better circumstances, but oftentimes it's tragedies like this that bring us together to talk about difficult events, and this time in Syria. It's hard to know where to begin, not the least of which because events on the ground are taking place and changing very rapidly, as is the Obama administration's policy in dealing with this, which has taken place over the last 2 weeks or so. Previously, policy dealing with Syria from the Obama administration was much slower to evolve. We have seen a change, and I'll talk a little bit about that towards the end of my talk. I think, as most of you know, the protests broke out around March 15th in Damascus, but they really got up and kicking on March 18th in the town of Deraa, southern Syria, between Damascus and the Jordanian frontier. It was in response to the regime's arrest of children between the ages of 10 and 14 years old who scrawled on a wall, "The people want the fall of the regime," the same motto that we used used by the protesters in Egypt to bring down the Mubarak regime. They were arrested, taken to Damascus. Their families were not informed about their whereabouts or their well-being. I have a lot of friends who are from the Dera area, and if anybody is here from Dera, I think it's safe to say that people in those areas particularly in those areas, are very straight-talking and oftentimes have very hot tempers, and in this case it's completely justified. They began to demand to know where they were, and began to protest on the street. The security forces, as usual, responded with brutality, killing 6. And thus started what I describe as the iron fist and the velvet glove approach to the protests. On the one hand, you smash the protesters and oftentimes kill them, and then what you do is very quickly follow up with some sort of offer of dialogue or some kind of offer of reforms. In this case, in Dera, it was a delegation of high-level officials who are originally from Dera, Farouk Ashara and particularly Vice Foreign Minister Faisal Maqdad, someone who's been here to Washington many times. They went to Dera, tried to calm things down. They released the children, but then the security forces again opened fire on the crowd and killed even more people. With every death comes a funeral, usually within 24 hours if possible, and then with every funeral comes another protest. So this very quickly spiraled out of control until such time as the security forces were unable to deal with the protests in Dera and in the Hauran region, which is what the overall region is called. They began to spread. They spread up to Damascus. They spread to the Syrian coast. They spread into the city of Homs, out in eastern Syria, and it was at that point that the military forces also began to be deployed. The regime deployed those forces as well. They were, and it's from those accounts and those deployments that we have stories about defections from the Syrian military. They have not been massive. They have happened. We have them on video. And it was at this point in the protests for the Obama administration, for those of us that in Washington, it was very difficult to be able to weigh up exactly what was going on the ground. Traditionally, the United States uses a variety of sources inside of countries like Syria, which are low information environments, to assess the situation. You compare with the local press accounts, which are not very forthcoming, combined with scuttlebutt that you hear, usually out of the side of the embassy, as well as with the intelligence services, and as well as the U.S. Embassy's conversations with the intelligence services and the Army. And then after that, you send your diplomats out to try and assess what's going on. What began to arise was a difference between what the embassy was able to assess and what the protesters were able to get out on videos. There were a number of contradictions between, for example, there were multiple reports of the Syrian forces using shelling in Dera, in and around Homs, specifically in a village called Tel Khalak, and also up around the Turkish-Syrian frontier up near Jisr Shukur. The problem was, of course, is that if you sent your defense attaché out to assess the situation, it would be very hard to find the hole or the exact hole that you're looking for in a building as a result of cannon fire. Over time, though, as the number of videos coming out went up and the protests got bigger and bigger, the U.S. government was able to better assess and weigh out and sift through all the reports. And I think the thing that struck them the most was not so much getting into the exact details of what happened and when and so on. These things are important. But overall, it was very clear that the Assad regime's approach, the iron fist and the velvet glove approach, was failing. And the reason why it was failing is that no matter how much they were deploying these forces, the protesters continued to come out every Friday en masse. And today we see some of the largest protests in the country. And this is a dynamic that's been going on as the regime has been trying to launch reforms inside of Syria. And they've talked about a number of constitutional reforms. Reform is very difficult for Bashar al-Assad. His family hails from the Alawite sect in Syria. They're a heterodox Shia offshoot of Shia Islam. Mainline Shia are 12ers, and the Alawites are 11ers. They regard Ali ibn Abi Talib as Christians regard Jesus, God incarnate. They are largely, ironically, secular, and they're also oftentimes very secretive in terms of their religious beliefs. They dominate the regime, and they serve as the core of the regime, about 13%. Gathered around them are other Shia heterodox offshoots, Druze, Ismailis, Circassians, and also Christians. And together, the minority-dominated regime, just dominated, not completely, make up about 26% of the population. Now, Syria's regime is minority-dominated, but it doesn't mean that everybody who's a minority in the country is a member of the regime. This is an important distinction. There are plenty of other, to stabilize this regime over time, Hafez al-Assad, the previous president, Bashar's father, gave the regime sort of Sunni coating or insulation. He co-opted Sunnis from Damascus and Aleppo, who are primarily motivated by trade, as well as Sunnis from Daraa, in the Hauran region, and eastern Syria, which in the U.S. press are regarded as tribal Syrians, but are maybe originally of perhaps Bedouin origin. But anyways, there are tribal affiliations. The problem for the regime is that the protests broke out and became a major crisis in Daraa, and that the support of people from that coating, that sort of tribal Syrian coating of Syria, have broken away, as well as a lot of other regime support has broken away over time. So now the problem with, and I'll end up with this a little bit, the problem with assessing what the tipping point of the regime in Syria is that Syria is a complicated mosaic of different sects. I mean, besides the minorities I described, the Sunni population, which is the majority in the country, is also incredibly diverse. Sunnis from Damascus and Aleppo are very distinct from the tribal Sunnis who I described, and they then, of course, are distinct from the Kurdish population inside of Syria is almost predominantly, I think, almost totally also Sunni, but is different ethnically. Because of the minority influence, the Alawite influence inside of the government, the chance of the military breaking away as an independent corporatist body and ousting the ruling family, as we saw in Egypt and in Tunisia, is very slim. It could happen. It could happen at a certain point. Those in the military decide to get rid of Bashar al-Assad and his family, but it's very difficult because the commanders of the security forces of the army are overwhelmingly either Alawite or other minorities. And most importantly, not because of their origins, but because of their allegiance traditionally to the Assad regime. So that's been very difficult to assess. And the U.S. government used the metrics, as we say, from Cairo and Tunisia to measure the Syrian revolution. The only problem is it doesn't really work because of the way that Syria is a distinctly different place than Egypt and Tunisia. So what has happened is that U.S. policy shifted in an area in a concept that was not applicable to Cairo and Tunisia, and that is the concept or the historical legacy of Hama. In 1982, the regime carried out a brutal massacre in Hama against then Muslim Brotherhood-led uprising in that city. Between 10 and 30,000 people were killed. The reason why we don't know is that many people just simply disappeared. It wasn't just the shelling of that city in 1982, but it was the associated roundup of people who never were seen again that exacerbated the issue. No other Arab country really has a similar, there are similar massacres which certainly have taken place, but in the case of Egypt and Tunisia, not the same. That hovered over the entire society. So, as the regime's response began to fail, the Obama administration watched very closely as the Assad regime threatened to move in with military and security forces into Hama, where now the city is outside the regime's control, and we have hundreds of thousands of people who are in the streets of that city. It's not insignificant. It's the country's fourth largest city, and that, combined with the other protests in the country, indicate that this is an ongoing crisis that will continue to be for some time. So that's the reason why you saw Robert Ford getting in his SUV and going up to Hama, as well as the French ambassador as well. They knew that a massacre was possible. They didn't know it was exactly going to happen. And until that time, he had really taken a much more an approach which mostly dealt with weighing out the evidence. Obviously, the Syrian regime did not like him going to Hama. I think you saw the protesters who spontaneously gathered out in front of the U.S. Embassy in Damascus and spontaneously scaled a 30-plus foot wall and put out the American flag and scrawled on the wall that Ford was a dog. Thank God he has a good sense of humor, and I think those of you that checked his Facebook notation can clearly see that. This is the public manifestation of a shift in U.S. thinking and that of Europeans and Turks on Syria. The question is now what to do about it. Thus far, it has been more designations from the Obama administration of specific individuals who are involved in the crackdown. In the pipeline, though, also is they've had a problem getting UN measures through because of blockage from the Russians and the Chinese. But one area that's currently being debated, and I think it's something that's going to be happening up here in the Hill as well, concerning energy sanctions on Syria. And it's of course, we have the bad example, perhaps, of Iraq and during Saddam Hussein's regime. Now, what makes Syria and Iraq different is that a much larger percentage of overall budgetary revenue for the Iraqis came from oil exports. Okay? In the case of Syria, because of declining fields, it only accounts for between a quarter and a third of government revenue. So energy is important for the Syrian regime. They don't have to tax anybody for it because the revenue is directly accrued to the state. And it means that targeting energy does not directly and immediately target the Syrian people. Will it have an effect on them? Yes, in the long term, it certainly would. But it would have a much larger effect on the regime. The regime would have two choices at that point: deficit spending and or to borrow money from the central bank at about $17 billion in reserves. In any case, individual designations are not enough to stop the bloodshed. We've now have far more people designated for human rights abuses than we do for Syria's regional behavior. We need to create necessity inside of the Assad regime to actually change. And I think most of you who have dealt with people that you know who have problems or loved ones who have problems and so on, do people really change unless they have to? No, they don't. And the necessity, the thing that creates necessity in this particular case is to focus on Syrian energy. And this will help facilitate the process. Will it be the only thing that we need to use? No, certainly not. It should be also diplomatic. Will it be something that we have to be very careful with so it doesn't play into the regime's propaganda to say that we are trying to hit the Syrian people? We have to be absolutely vigilant on that. Okay, so in terms of public statements on this, in terms of crafting legislation, it's very important to start out as narrow as possible and to widen it as the crisis unfolds so we can target the regime, not the Syrian people. We don't have a problem with the Syrian people, we have a problem with the Syrian regime. And with that, I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Andrew, and Stephanie and Jessica for inviting us. I think my comments will be a good follow-on from what Andrew sort of laid out as far as what's been going on in the past few months and where we are. My family originally is from Syria, and as Stephanie mentioned, they escaped there and were political refugees once the Baathists got into power and consolidated power in Syria. Any of the other political parties were eliminated. And one of the things I want to do is, as we add a human element to this, to realize the culture of fear that exists in Syria, that I hope as you leave here you realize that this is one of the worst regimes that exists on the planet since World War II, and that ultimately it has oppressed its people and created a culture in which brothers report on brothers, families report on other families, and that ultimately, you know, what Andrew mentioned is